So the first week, for the most part, of the college football season has come and gone, and there are a lot of interesting takeaways. One of them being that the Power Four played really well as a collective whole, right? Conference by conference. Those Power Four schools, ACC, Big Ten, Big 12, SEC, and Notre Dame, performed really well. And it's easy to look at the results and say, like, oh, wow. You can see that the Big Ten, who went 17-1 in the first week, or the SEC, they went 13-3, they are head and shoulders above everybody else. And I think that is kind of the big takeaway from a lot of people. You look at the SEC scores, there are 70s and zeros in a lot of places. But I think context matters. And I think it's an important exercise to look at why it just might not necessarily be the case that it's as cut and dry as it looks. Could it very easily be that the Big Ten and SEC are head and shoulders above everybody else? Yes, it could be that. But I don't think it's necessarily fair to make that assumption after 1 week. And here's why. Just like the Big Ten was 17-1 and the SEC was 13-3 in the opening week, the Big 12 was actually 14-2. The Big 12 had a better record in week 1 than the SEC did. The ACC, who is viewed as inherently inferior, and I don't know for certain whether that's, I think, yes, there are question marks. Obviously, Clemson got waxed on the national stage by one of the best teams in America. And we'll talk more about that on Tuesday. And North Carolina State struggled for a long time with Western Carolina. And Virginia Tech flat out lost to Vanderbilt. So there are questions. But the ACC was 12-3 in the opening week, if you don't count. And I don't count. I don't think it's fair to count Florida State versus Georgia Tech. And this obviously happens before Florida State plays Boston College. But those are all conference games. So I don't think it's a wash to say the ACC won one game and lost another. Like, I don't think that's fair. So I'm not counting that. But 12-3 is not far from the pack of the SEC and the Big 12. But what is interesting to look at are the number of games that happened against FCS schools, which I think is entirely too damn high. And then also what the record was versus Power 4. Power 4 versus Power 4, mano-a-mano, relatively equal standing. What did those games look like? The ACC was 12-3 overall, not counting Florida State versus Georgia Tech, and this is before Florida State plays Boston College. They had 7 games versus the FCS. But in Power 4 versus Power 4, the ACC went 1-3. That's a problem, an issue, and one that they'll have to talk about and figure out. The Big Ten, as I mentioned, went 17-1, which is somewhat impressive until you start to account for the names on the list of the opponents. There are 6 FCS schools. And then you throw in, Akron and Fresno State. And the Big Ten played 3 Power 4 versus Power 4 games and won 2 of them. The only loss was North Carolina beat Minnesota as the Golden Gophers missed a last-second field goal. So 2-1 versus the Power 4 is at least better. But when you look at, 6 of them were FCS, Florida Atlantic, Western Michigan, Akron, Fresno State, UConn, Florida International, UTEP, Miami of Ohio. It was not murderer's row by any stretch of the imagination, Weber State. But after USC beats LSU Sunday night, it does lead some credence to the idea of like, hey, LSU was viewed as a college football playoff contender right off the bat because Brian Kelly, LSU, SEC. And USC was viewed as, man, if Lincoln Riley doesn't get this team going, he's going to be on the hot seat. And instead, they beat LSU. They had Brian Kelly slamming the table in disgust after the the game in his post-game press conference. They're 2-1 versus Power 4, I think, is how you should look at what your perception is of each conference, rather than the Big Ten was 17-1. They were 2-1 versus the Power 4. The Big 12 was 14-2 in the opening week. And 11 of those games were against FCS. And that's, to me, that is like, okay, this is where the issues lie in the, if you're going to have an expanded 12-team playoff and you're going to figure out, all right, who is the best team here, who's the best team there, which conferences are the best, you got to get on. Everybody is working under the same schedule guidelines, right? Doesn't have to say that everybody is playing each other in an equal schedule, because you're never going to be able to do that. But everybody's got to figure out, are we playing 9 games? Are we playing 8 conference games? Are we playing a non-conference Power 4 team? Are we allowing FCS versus FBS matchups? Because I think the answer to that should be no, because you can pad your stats really easily, and it's never really held against somebody that, okay, if you compare resumes, nobody looks at it at the end of the year and says, this team's 11-1, this team's 10-2, but 11-1 played an FCS school and 10-2 didn't. It's never viewed that way. So I think you just take that out of the equation. But the Big 12 went 14-2 and played 11 FCS schools in the opening week. They go 1-1 in Power 4 games, where West Virginia got pushed around by Penn State in a game that, I told you, like, I don't think West Virginia's going to win, but I think they're going to play Penn State really close. They didn't. Penn State looked very, very, very good to start the season. And that was maybe the biggest high-profile Big 12 game outside of Colorado struggling to beat North Dakota State on Thursday night. And then finally the SEC, 13-3 in the opening week. And I know that the argument from Big Ten fans is that the SEC plays nobody out of conference. They play FCS schools the week before Thanksgiving. And some of that is true, right? Florida scheduled Miami and deserves credit for scheduling that game. LSU deserves credit for wanting and being willing to play USC in Las Vegas to start the season. Georgia deserves credit for scheduling Clemson. Texas A&M deserves credit for scheduling Notre Dame. Problem is the SEC went 2-3 in Power 4 versus Power 4 and got their doors beat off. Florida got manhandled by Miami. USC probably had not a whole lot of reason to beat LSU, and they did. Georgia is one of the best teams in the country and showed it against Clemson. And Notre Dame went to Texas A&M and beat the Aggies on their home field. But I don't know how much that's going to be held against the SEC later on down the season, because those are teams that are viewed as middle of the pack, right? There are a couple of teams at the top of the SEC that we view as like, okay, Georgia, Texas can be national championship contenders, and Alabama, and national championship contenders, SEC title contenders. But then there's that Tennessee, your Tennessee, your LSU, your Texas A&M that were ranked in the top 25, your Oklahoma, Missouri, and some of those teams obviously did not lose. Some of those teams looked very impressive and put up a lot of points against FCS schools. But when your middle of the pack goes out and doesn't perform very well against other Power 4 teams, I don't think you should, like, and the SEC, by the way, has deserved the benefit of the doubt at the top of the conference. They have been the 1,000-pound gorilla on the block for a while now. But my point of contention has always kind of been their middle of the pack is the same as everybody else's middle of the pack, and we pretend that their middle of the pack would be the top dogs in other conferences. And I don't necessarily know that that's the case. And I think you see it on display in week 1. And I get that that's kind of hypocritical for me when the whole point of this is to say, don't take a lot from week 1 results. But I think the one part you should take away from is the Power 4 versus Power 4. ACC's 1-3, Big 12's 1-1, SEC's 2-3, Big 10 is 2-1. That, I think, should be your takeaway of when you look at nobody cares what happened versus Murray State and Arkansas Pine Bluff and Illinois State. It's Penn State versus West Virginia. It's Georgia versus Clemson. It's Texas A&M versus Notre Dame. Those are the games that matter and should alter the perception of conferences as a whole going forward. And I don't think they ever do, and I think they should. And I think that should be in your arsenal when you discuss this at the bar, at the water cooler at work, with your buddies, in the garage drinking beer. Those games are the ones that should matter. Because when you start to throw around, well, the SEC went 48-10 in non-conference or whatever number, like, okay, but how many of those 10 losses are against other Power 5 schools, other Power 4 schools, and Notre Dame? That should be what matters. And I don't think it does. And I think it should. That'll do it for today's episode of the Daily Huddle. Appreciate you making us a part of your day, however it is, wherever it is you're doing so. If you're watching on YouTube, hit the subscribe button. Make sure you're getting all the great college football content we're pumping out. Listen on the podcast feed. Drop a 5-star review. It goes a long way in helping out the channel. I'll see you tomorrow for another episode of the Daily